They called themselves the Zarkonian Dominion, rulers of 1,000 systems, an empire older than most stars, convinced of their eternal supremacy. From their throne world, they issued decrees with the casual cruelty of gods, and lesser species obeyed, bowed, bled. Conquest wasn't war to them. It was ritual. A cycle. A script written and rewritten in the bones of the fallen. And now, it was humanity's turn to kneel. The transmission reached Earth like an ancient decree from a dying god. A single, cold message: submit and be preserved. Resist and be extinguished. It came not from fear or negotiation, but as a courtesy, a notification of inevitability. The Dominion didn't expect negotiation. They never negotiated. They consumed. But the humans didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't even scramble for diplomacy. They simply smiled. Not with joy. Not with arrogance. But something else. Something older. It unsettled the few analysts in the Dominion who still believed in reading species psychology. The rest laughed. Primitive bipeds from a minor blue world? Smiling at the galaxy's apex predator? What an endearing response. They had catalogued humanity decades earlier. Late to space travel. Still fractured in ideology. Still warring among themselves just a century ago. A single fragile world with some scattered colonies, no empire, no advanced wormhole drives, no planet crackers. And yet they smiled. The Dominion's generals saw no threat. The fleets were prepared. 100 warships deployed from Core Command, heading toward Sol. They brought with them ceremonial scribes to record another swift victory, genetic recorders to archive another species' defeat, and architects to design occupation structures. Their only concern was how long it would take to civilize these savages. A few months, perhaps. A year at most. Resistance was irrelevant. The result would be the same. Their arrogance was not born of ignorance, it was built on precedent. Hundreds of species had resisted before. And every time, without exception, they were turned into obedient tools or extinct memories. The Zarkonian approach was methodical, efficient. First, orbit-to-surface bombardment of key military installations. Then, orbital occupation, and systematic dismantling of resistance. Finally, genetic assimilation or extermination depending on compliance. It always worked. But not this time. There were whispers already, in corners the Dominion refused to see. A scout vessel had disappeared near the edge of the Kuiper Belt. Another, closer to Neptune, had sent one final image before vanishing, a strange glint of steel in the darkness, a structure like a jagged crown wrapped in shadow. The analysts had dismissed it. Sensor ghosts. Glitches. Fear-induced hallucinations. But it was real. Still, the fleet pressed on. They entered the Sol system with shields high, weapons charged, formation tight. Humanity responded with nothing. No radio hails. No plasma bursts. No desperate attempts to flee or negotiate. Just one brief signal, as if acknowledging their arrival. Welcome. The Dominion took that as further confirmation of human naivety. But the few surviving officers from what would later be known as the First Contact Massacre would remember those words for the rest of their short lives. Not a welcome born of submission, but one born of readiness. Mars was chosen as the staging ground. Easy atmosphere, weak resistance, and ideal for demonstrating force. Dropships deployed. Orbital control was assumed. Ground teams landed. Beacons were placed. The Empire had done this 1,000 times. Then came the silence. The kind of silence that pulses behind your ears and crawls down your spine. No incoming resistance. No counterattack. Not even a protest. For 6 minutes, they moved without interference. Until the sky tore open. Not with energy beams. Not with quantum disruptions. With metal. With speed. With physics sharpened into a weapon. From the darkness of space, Earth's silent guardians revealed themselves. Rail satellites hidden in planetary shadows. Kinetic weapons loaded with tungsten rods and guided by AI so precise they could hit a coin from orbit. There were no warning shots. No chance to adapt. Within seconds, ships disintegrated mid-air. Dropships shredded before they touched ground. Orbital command vessels erupted like fireworks, silent, brilliant, final. In less than 2 minutes, 70% of the Dominion's arrival fleet was gone. No escape. No signal. Just void and debris. The survivors attempted evasive maneuvers, only to trigger automated traps, mine arrays and cloaked drones operating on untraceable frequencies. Human engineers had spent years preparing for this moment, not with overwhelming power, but with unbreakable precision. They hadn't built fleets to challenge the Dominion head-on. They'd built traps. They'd built nightmares. And they'd waited patiently for the enemy to step inside. The surviving flagship attempted retreat. It fled toward Jupiter, broadcasting desperate signals to nearby sectors. But the message was never received. Not because of jamming, but because there was nothing left to receive it. That was the other thing the Dominion never considered: speed. Humanity hadn't wasted time on galactic bureaucracy or ceremonial fleets. Their colonies were experimental weapon labs disguised as mining stations. Their asteroid belts were armories. Every moon was an outpost. Every derelict satellite, a blade in waiting. They hadn't just prepared for war. They had designed their solar system as a kill box. The commander of the fleet, High Strategos Vuroc, survived for exactly 43 minutes after the initial attack. His last words, recorded in the ship's black box before it was ejected into space, were short. "We weren't prepared for this. They're not primitive. They're predators." The Dominion tried to erase those words. But they survived. Passed hand to hand, whispered in shadows. And slowly, across the stars, fear began to bloom. Because in all their conquests, all their grand victories, they had never faced an enemy who smiled when threatened. Not laughed. Not pleaded. Smiled. As if they'd known this moment would come. As if they had been waiting for it. No demands were issued from Earth. No retaliation beyond the solar system. Just silence once more. Intentional. Measured. The kind of silence that isn't passive, but surgical. In their arrogance, the Dominion believed they were walking into a weak species cradle. Instead, they had walked into a grave. Their own. And humanity smiled. Reinforcements were dispatched immediately. The Dominion's pride would not allow hesitation. The loss of an invasion fleet was an anomaly, not a defeat. At least, that's how they rationalized it. Protocol dictated escalation. A secondary fleet, twice the size of the first, left from the nearest sector stronghold. Their orders were clear: secure the Sol system by any means necessary, dissect human defenses, and return Dominion to the throne. They entered cautiously this time, scanning every inch of the system with paranoia. Every asteroid was suspect. Every heat signature, a potential ambush. Yet the system remained still. Empty, even. There were no human ships in sight, no comm signals, no challenge. Just the vast coldness of space, and the ancient orbit of indifferent planets. The fleet fanned out near the orbital edge of Mars, wary of the previous ambush. But no railguns fired. No satellites stirred. The enemy didn't respond. Command assumed the first defense wave had exhausted human capability. The element of surprise had simply been maximized. Now, humans had nothing left to offer. The order was given to deploy ground forces to Mars once more. This time with planetary scanners, jamming fields, and continuous aerial overwatch. Touchdown was achieved with minimal resistance. Units spread across the Red Plains. Human structures were discovered, small, oddly designed installations buried beneath regolith, unpowered and seemingly abandoned. But their materials were alien to Dominion sensors, dense, patterned with magnetic interference fields that defied typical scans. One squad pried open a vault near a collapsed canyon wall. Inside, they found rows of strange metallic rods, each suspended in anti-gravity fields. Before analysis could begin, the rods ignited. Not chemically, not thermally, but kinetically. They vanished from sight, launched at hypersonic speeds directly through the planet's crust, triggering seismic chain reactions across the surface. Mars began to tear itself apart. Fault lines activated by design. Ice deposits flash-boiled into steam under pressure. Ancient, invisible infrastructure, buried by humans in preparation, detonated in precise rhythm. It wasn't an accident. Mars had been rigged as a message. This wasn't desperation. This was orchestration. Dominion Command attempted to evacuate, but it was already too late. Surface tremors buckled drop zones. Atmospheric conditions collapsed into a choking storm of debris and radiation. More than half of the landed personnel were lost instantly. The rest were stranded, unable to ascend through the atmosphere as the gravity-stabilizing fields failed. Orbiting ships attempted rescue, only to be torn apart by a sudden swarm of drones launched from Deimos and Phobos. Not just recon drones. Assassins. Each drone was small, agile, and self-directed. They didn't fire projectiles. They didn't need to. They moved like insects, hundreds per ship, slamming into critical systems, fusing circuitry with directed EMP pulses, or puncturing hulls through exhaust ports. Within 10 minutes, Mars was a graveyard, and the fleet was reduced to a crippled handful of vessels in a decaying orbit. Humanity didn't send a message afterward. They didn't explain or warn. They simply reclaimed the silence. What stunned the Dominion wasn't the brutality, it was the clarity. Every move had been made with deliberate control. This wasn't a species lashing out. It was a species performing a strategy they had designed long ago. They hadn't developed weapons for counterattack. They had shaped their entire planetary system for one function: to eliminate any invading force that reached too far, too quickly. Worse still, the Dominion discovered that the attack hadn't even required human presence. All of it had been automated, triggered, scheduled. That meant the humans were still holding back, watching, measuring. Military analysts began poring over data recovered from black box fragments. They couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. The humans hadn't used energy weapons, antimatter, or gravitational collapse tech. They used motion, pressure, density, friction, physics in its rawest, most unforgiving forms. They'd weaponized orbital mechanics, surface instability, and inertia. In short, they'd taken tools of mining, construction, and transport, and evolved them into perfect instruments of war. This was not a failure of strength. This was a failure of understanding. The Dominion had always assumed superior technology dictated victory. But humans didn't match their tech, they bypassed it. Dominion force shields, meant to repel plasma bursts, were useless against hyper-accelerated metal rods. Their targeting systems couldn't keep up with swarms operating on predictive learning loops. Their defensive protocols, built around symmetrical warfare, crumbled under the weight of asymmetric chaos. Command suggested a temporary retreat. The Council overruled it. Retreat was dishonor. They couldn't afford to show weakness to the outer colonies. Already, murmurs were rising. If a primitive species could resist the Dominion, what message would that send to the rest of the galaxy? And so, they prepared the third wave. This time, they brought dreadnoughts. Carriers the size of cities. Strategic weapons forbidden in most engagements, orbital bombardment platforms, fleet crackers, even dark energy destabilizers. It was overkill, but that was the point. Make an example. Send a storm so overwhelming that resistance would become a memory, not an option. Yet by the time they reached the Sol system again, the humans were gone. Earth remained. Silent. Calm. The orbital zones were empty. Mars was still shattered, drifting in volcanic haze. But no transmissions, no weapon locks, no signs of defense. The Dominion moved in, cautious but determined. They established orbit. Began deploying scanning platforms. Probes descended into Earth's atmosphere. And then, as if waking a slumbering beast, the trap closed. Saturn's rings, harmless, decorative to the Dominion, ignited. Millions of micromines, hidden in ice and rock, detonated in sequential arcs. Shockwaves rippled outward, tearing into the supply lines strung between vessels. Communications dropped. Then, Neptune's moons lit up, broadcasting a wide-spectrum burst that triggered cascading failures across Dominion software. Not corruption, reprogramming. Their own systems began locking out commands, rerouting controls, turning weapons offline, shields inoperative. Within 60 seconds, chaos. Not from human ships, but from the Dominion's own systems rebelling. It was never about firepower. Humanity didn't build bigger guns. They built smarter wars. The third wave limped home with barely half its vessels. Some disappeared entirely. And for the first time in centuries, the Dominion had no words. No response. No confidence. Because they finally understood. The smile wasn't defiance. It was a warning. And they had ignored it. Now, it was too late. They had underestimated humanity's mind, not just its machines. While the Dominion obsessed over fleet tonnage and firepower, humans had been studying their enemies. Not just their weapons, but their politics. Their internal fractures. The thin lines holding their empire together. The humans saw the Dominion not as a solid monolith, but as a layered brittle structure just waiting for pressure in the right place. And they applied it with surgical precision. The Dominion's empire was built on conquest, but maintained by obedience, forced through fear, and upheld by thousands of vassal species. Each one taxed, monitored, subjugated. Most had no love for their overlords. They served only to survive. Humanity understood that survival instinct better than the Dominion did. So before the first battle even began, human intelligence agencies began seeding whispers into the void. Through encrypted pulses, intercepted trade packets, and salvaged Dominion networks, they made contact with those forced into chains long ago. What they offered was not freedom in the abstract, it was power. Access to tools, schematics, and technology that bypassed Dominion locks. They didn't ask for revolution. They asked questions. Quietly. Strategically. Do you want to keep dying for a throne that sees you as disposable? Do you want your children conscripted, your skies filled with warships, your names erased from the annals of history? Or do you want control over your future? Some ignored it. Most didn't. The first cracks showed during a skirmish in the Epsilon Drift. A small Dominion fleet, backed by Othelian auxiliaries, attempted to blockade a suspected human supply lane. Midway through engagement, the Othelians turned their guns on the Dominion vessels, vaporizing their flagship in one controlled salvo. No declaration. No demands. Just betrayal, swift and cold. It shocked the Dominion. But they labeled it an isolated mutiny. An anomaly. Then it happened again. And again. Entire regions began destabilizing. Some fleets refused orders. Others began disappearing. Garrisons went dark. Vassal planets shut down Dominion outposts without warning. One system transmitted an unencrypted message directly to the Dominion High Council. We learned from the humans. We learned that fear is a leash. And we're tired of collars. The timing wasn't coincidence. Humanity had released coordinated data caches to sympathetic resistance groups. They weren't filled with weapons, but something far more dangerous: Dominion secrets. Suppressed histories. Records of manipulated famines, sterilization programs, and planetary purges the Empire had buried centuries ago. Documents authenticated by Dominion seals, leaked by defectors who no longer wished to be complicit. These revelations ignited buried hatred into flame. Humanity didn't demand loyalty. They didn't ask to be followed. They simply told the truth, and watched the consequences unfold. The Dominion attempted damage control. Propaganda, countermeasures, executions. They branded humanity as manipulators, liars, sowers of chaos. But it was too late. The narrative had already changed. In every shadowed colony, in every garrison built on blood, humanity had become something more than a rebel force. They had become the catalyst. The symbol of a possibility that had been unthinkable for generations, that the Dominion could fall. Meanwhile, humans continued their campaign without overreach. They didn't send fleets to conquer rebelling systems. They sent medical aid, farming technology, defense tools. And then they left. No tribute demanded. No governance imposed. Just empowerment. It baffled their enemies. Dominion doctrine assumed that power was always followed by domination. But humans were not there to rule the stars, they were there to ensure no one else did. This strategy wasn't merely moral, it was tactical. Every vassal species that turned against the Dominion stretched its fleets thinner. Every rebellion drew away resources, fractured communication, strained logistics. Humanity didn't need to destroy the Empire. They just needed to help others realize they could walk away from it. The tipping point came when the Trelvani Consortium, a mid-tier Dominion ally known for its mercantile fleets, declared neutrality. This was not rebellion. It was, on the surface, a simple economic maneuver. But beneath it was a shift in cosmic perception. The Trelvani, famed for their obsession with probability, had calculated that the Dominion was no longer a guaranteed victor. Their withdrawal sent shockwaves through the interstellar markets. Insurance rates on Dominion shipping tripled. Trade routes collapsed. Panic gripped the outer rim. The Dominion was bleeding. Not from a knife to the throat, but 1,000 cuts behind the knees. They still had power. Still had fleets. But now, they also had doubt. That, humanity knew, was far deadlier. In response, the Dominion launched a coordinated propaganda blitz. They began showcasing victories, reanimating ancient war footage, parading their flagship dreadnoughts through loyal systems. They needed their empire to feel invincible again. Humanity countered with a single broadcast. A compilation of real-time footage gathered from surrendered Dominion ships and allied defectors. It showed every recent failure, every internal revolt, every collapsed chain of command. It wasn't dramatized. It wasn't edited. Just raw truth, time-stamped and verified. At the end of the transmission, a single line appeared across a blank screen. Empires fall. It's not a matter of if, only when. The Dominion blocked the signal. But not fast enough. It was copied, remixed, transmitted 1,000,000 times through 1,000,000 networks. It became a mantra in resistance circles. A prayer whispered in bunkers. A certainty. Humanity had turned the Dominion's greatest strength, fear, into a weapon against itself. Every fleet sent to crush Earth only made the humans more terrifying to the masses. Every punishment inflicted on rebellious systems only validated the cause. The Dominion had entered a war it didn't understand, a war of perception, morale, and cultural gravity. One they were losing. The irony was complete. The Empire had sent its best, its brightest, its most advanced. And they had been broken, not by brute force, but by a smiling species from a single world who knew how to read fault lines in an empire and press exactly where it hurt. Because humans didn't want submission. They didn't need control. They only needed everyone else to realize what they had always known, that the throne was never as stable as it pretended to be. And once that illusion was shattered, there was no going back. The Dominion responded with a shift in tactics. Subjugation had failed. Psychological control had slipped. Diplomacy was irrelevant. Now, the goal was extermination. Humanity would be erased not as a warning, but as a necessity. What they couldn't control, they would annihilate. They unleashed their Apex Legion, an elite force engineered over centuries, enhanced beyond natural limitations. Every soldier was genetically sculpted for strength, reflex, and sensory perception. Their armors were bioreactive, bonded to nervous systems, and their weapons adjusted dynamically to environmental conditions. These were not troops. They were extinction agents. Their mission, land on Earth's lunar outpost, establish forward control, and decapitate human command infrastructure. The moon offered no real atmosphere, limited mobility, and no margin for error. The Dominion believed this would favor their advanced systems. They were wrong. The Apex Legion arrived in perfect formation, armored and armed, their dropships descending like steel daggers. But the surface was not empty. Human forces were waiting, silent, unmoving, low-profile suits barely visible against the lunar regolith. There were no banners. No vocal commands. Just movement, deliberate, unbroken, inhumanly synchronized. The battle didn't unfold with screams and plasma fire. It unfolded in silence, a massacre orchestrated with mechanical efficiency. Dominion soldiers advanced using conventional tactics, flanking, cover, suppression. Human operatives didn't respond conventionally. They didn't retreat or return fire in expected patterns. They moved unpredictably, vanishing into craters, launching vertical strikes, leveraging gravitational anomalies to convert small jumps into lethal attacks. The Apex Legion quickly discovered that raw strength was irrelevant against enemies who never fought on even ground. One by one, squads were isolated, dissected, and erased. Their advanced optics were flooded by mirrored signal pulses, turning their vision against them. Their armor was exploited by nanite swarms released from lunar dust, infiltrating joints and corroding internal systems. Their reflexes, once perfect, became liabilities. Every reaction was anticipated, countered, mirrored. Human operatives had trained not to match the enemy, but to outmaneuver them entirely. They studied physics, reaction time, gravitational response, and adapted faster than any algorithm could track. Every fallen Dominion soldier left behind armor salvaged and repurposed. Every weapon was disassembled, modified, redeployed within hours. Human tactics evolved mid-battle, using their own dead as data points. The few Dominion survivors who managed to retreat did so without dignity, crawling through dust, abandoning wounded, transmitting corrupted reports to command. What they carried back wasn't intelligence. It was horror. The Dominion's elite had never encountered a foe that used terrain as a weapon, silence as a tactic, and loss as fuel for adaptation. Every advantage had been predicted and dismantled. Their biological superiority meant nothing against minds that rewrote strategy in real time. Their coordination faltered under pressure. Humanity's deep neural field communication, silent, signal-proof tactical interfacing, rendered every move a collective action, faster than spoken orders could keep up. Back on Earth, analysis of the conflict was complete before the Dominion ships had even left orbit. Human systems cataloged every maneuver, every flaw, every predictable pattern in Dominion combat logic. These were not just notes for the next battle. They were instructions for domination. The Dominion learned another hard lesson during the siege of Station Thorn, one of humanity's deep space stations positioned on a hollowed-out asteroid in the outer system. Expecting resistance, the Dominion deployed bioweapons, airborne nanopathogens designed to disable life forms based on standard physiology. These weapons had worked countless times across countless species. But they failed against humans. Catastrophically. Human immune systems were not uniform. They were chaotic, born from centuries of mutation, adaptation, and exposure to an uncontrolled planetary biosphere. The bioweapons triggered different reactions in every individual. Some flushed the pathogens instantly. Others adapted mid-infection. A few even absorbed and neutralized the nanites, creating internal antibodies that were transmitted via contact to nearby personnel. What the Dominion failed to grasp was that Earth had never been sterile. It was a crucible of immune evolution. No species born from such a planet could ever be vulnerable in predictable ways. Attempts to modify the pathogen in real time were met with another shock. Humans captured samples mid-attack, reverse-engineered the strain, and broadcast countermeasures across the local network in less than 90 minutes. Bioweapon warfare was rendered obsolete within a single day. Dominion bioengineers were stunned. Never had a species rendered their most complex pathogen tools ineffective in a single cycle. The Dominion's confidence fractured further during the Titan offensive. Expecting a direct confrontation, they deployed ground tanks, atmospheric drones, and mech units in full force. Humanity didn't meet them on the field. They attacked from above, below, and within. They jammed propulsion systems by altering ion field density with microresonance pulses. They infected command units with viruses hidden inside broken Dominion helmets abandoned during the lunar conflict. By the time the tanks fired their first shots, half their systems were compromised, their units misidentified friend from foe, and supply routes were bombarded with scavenged munitions laced with resonant EMP triggers. When Dominion Command attempted to regroup, they discovered that communications were useless. Not jammed. Hijacked. The humans weren't just listening. They were replying, mimicking Dominion Command signatures with flawless precision. Troops received orders to retreat, then re-engage, then stand down. Chaos spread. The field collapsed. The psychological toll was exponential. Soldiers stopped trusting their leaders. Officers double-checked every command. Entire units froze in uncertainty. Humanity didn't need to destroy the Dominion's bodies. They dismantled their cohesion. What became clear, finally, was that the Dominion had entered a war they were biologically, technologically, and mentally unfit to fight. Their tools were powerful, but rigid. Their systems were efficient, but predictable. Their soldiers were strong, but narrow in scope. Humans were not stronger. They were not faster. They were not older. But they were unpredictable, self-replicating engines of adaptation. They used every loss as leverage, every kill as knowledge, every enemy tactic as a new variable to dissect and counter. The Dominion built warriors. But the humans built weapons that learned. Systems that evolved. Minds that grew sharper under pressure. And those minds were no longer reacting. They were hunting. The Dominion realized containment was no longer viable. Humanity was not an outbreak to be quarantined, but a contagion of defiance that spread through systems faster than fleets could travel. The High Council shifted its posture from domination to annihilation. Tactical losses could be tolerated. Strategic humiliation could not. They deployed Project Ashfall, a classified initiative designed for extinction-level retaliation. 3 colonies were selected. Targets meant not for conquest, but for incineration. The first was Nova Lagos, a terraformed outpost hosting nearly 2 million civilians. The Dominion didn't bother with warnings. A singularity warhead was dropped into the upper atmosphere. Within seconds, a gravitational pulse compressed the colony's core infrastructure into itself, collapsing buildings, vehicles, and people into a single sphere of matter before evaporating in a silent burst of radiation. Nothing remained but scorched ground and scattered orbiting debris. The second target, Atlas Reach, was destroyed remotely. Dominion hackers flooded the colony's AI-managed infrastructure with viruses designed to override life support, disable energy fields, and invert atmospheric pressure controls. Habitation domes exploded inward. Oxygen combusted. Survivors suffocated in silence. Rescue vessels sent automated distress pings that were looped endlessly into the void, each echo a reminder that help would never arrive. The third, Karen's Hollow, didn't go quietly. The inhabitants detected the Dominion fleet early and activated emergency defensive protocols. They held for 3 hours, long enough to transmit live feeds of their final stand. Families sheltered beneath bunkers as orbital fire rained down. Medics worked under collapsing structures. Final messages were spoken and uploaded. When the end came, it was total. The colony vanished in a concussive wave of atmospheric compression. These weren't battles. They were executions. The purpose was psychological. The Dominion wanted to remind humanity what absolute power looked like. They wanted the resistance to crumble under grief. What they got instead was a shift in tone so absolute it terrified even those watching from afar. Humanity didn't scream. They didn't beg. They stopped speaking. Across all networks, communication from Earth ceased for 48 hours. No broadcasts. No military updates. No public responses. Just a systemic blackout that pulsed like the breath held before a storm. When the silence broke, it was not with a declaration of war, but a sequence upload, code packages, schematics, and autonomous AI instructions released to every allied and neutral system. Not encrypted. Not protected. Open. It was not vengeance. It was empowerment. Blueprints for mobile defense platforms, counter-Dominion malware, biocontainment protocols, and energy recycling reactors. Entire libraries of human design dumped into the public sphere without price. Humanity didn't just mourn their dead, they weaponized their memory. The message was clear: if we are to fall, we will leave behind nothing but tools for your freedom. This was not the reaction the Dominion expected. They had counted on fear. Instead, they had catalyzed unity. In less than a week, over 100 systems adopted human tech into their infrastructure. Civilian vessels were retrofitted with defensive shielding derived from salvaged railgun arrays. Mining ships were converted into long-range artillery platforms. Resistance cells that had once begged for help were now building arsenals from shared knowledge. Dominion patrols found themselves surrounded not by military vessels, but by civilian convoys capable of resisting interdiction. The Dominion tried to suppress the spread. They targeted relay stations, hijacked communication hubs, and blacklisted system AIs suspected of facilitating the distribution. It didn't work. The information was already loose. Memory sticks smuggled inside protein rations. Data packets embedded in music files. They couldn't kill the signal. It had gone viral. Meanwhile, Earth's production tripled. There were no speeches, no televised broadcasts, no grand announcements. Just factories glowing at all hours. Orbiting yards expanding. Human colonies, once isolated and sparse, began linking through shadow relays, wormhole folds operating just beyond Dominion detection thresholds. A dark grid formed beneath known space, a web of movement invisible to traditional surveillance. Ships moved faster, more silently. Coordination reached machine-level precision. Humanity stopped reacting and started accelerating. They converted asteroid mining platforms into mobile forges, producing weapons mid-flight. Outposts became testbeds for energy redirection systems and rapid clone drone fleets. Every battle was now a prototype run, every skirmish a data harvest for optimization. Their war became self-learning, recursive, evolving without pause. Even their losses were strategic. Dominion forces began noticing a pattern. When they overwhelmed human forces, they found facilities already stripped of data, AIs wiped clean, personnel evacuated with clinical efficiency. The humans didn't wait to be attacked. They predicted it, responded in advance, and left traps behind. During the Alara incident, Dominion forces finally caught a major human convoy in a cross-system ambush. It should have been a turning point. It wasn't. The convoy had left behind a trail of decoy signals and misaligned subspace echoes. Dominion ships gave chase, only to find themselves isolated inside a distorted gravity well engineered using an artificial binary system. They weren't attacked. They were simply trapped. Engines overloaded. Communications jammed. One by one, they imploded. No battle. Just removal. It was a message wrapped in science. The Dominion began to fracture internally. Some commanders questioned the strategy. Others questioned the war. A few vanished, disappeared from the chain of command entirely. Rumors swirled of defections, of private pacts with human intermediaries offering sanctuary in exchange for silence. No one knew for sure. But the fear was growing, even in the council chambers where fear had never entered before. Because for the first time, they had no idea what the humans would do next. The pattern was broken. There were no predictable cycles. No negotiation points. The humans were no longer just defending themselves. They were preparing something. And the Dominion, for all its might, could do nothing but wait. The Dominion expected retaliation in force, human fleets charging into contested territory, desperate to avenge their dead. But instead of firestorms and sieges, there was only absence. Communications lines began to fail across the outer systems. Relay stations went dark. Patrol ships missed scheduled check-ins. Surveillance arrays recorded distortions, brief flickers in local space, always followed by silence. The Dominion had prepared for open war. What they received was something worse. Entire listening posts disappeared without a trace. Outposts found with no power, no survivors, no external damage. Just emptiness. Doors locked from within. Defense systems untouched. No signs of battle. Only internal systems recording a final entry, connection lost. Planetary governors vanished. Small, unnoticed command centers deep in the Dominion's infrastructure simply stopped reporting. At first, it was dismissed as coincidence. Then, as sabotage. Then, as a ghost campaign. The Dominion never believed in phantoms. Now they had no choice. They called them specters, black ops units running silent, leaving no traces, no signals, no survivors. No official documentation ever confirmed their existence, but everyone in the upper command began to whisper the name. The Dominion's elite intelligence network traced the pattern. Humans weren't attacking with ships or fleets. They were surgically erasing the Empire's nerve endings. Command centers, encryption cores, AI overseers, all removed, one by one. Spectre protocols had been activated. The humans didn't invent stealth warfare. They perfected it. Their units operated on quantum-linked field channels with no detectable emissions. Their armor bent light, heat, and vibration across multiple spectra. They didn't destroy infrastructure. They corrupted its function. Entire databanks turned into loops, weapon systems frozen mid-cycle, doors sealed with new command hierarchies locked behind alien encryption keys. The Dominion tried to respond, but their commands failed. Their systems no longer recognized them as masters. In the Ramir cluster, the Dominion deployed counter-infiltration squads to track suspected Spectre activity. The squads vanished. Weeks later, their own headquarters detonated from within using explosives fabricated on-site from materials never documented entering the facility. Not a single Spectre was seen. Only the aftermath. Fear began to grow, not among the soldiers, but in the command hierarchy. They stopped trusting their own networks. Encryption standards were overhauled weekly. AI cores were stripped down and replaced with analog backups. The Dominion, the most technologically advanced empire in the galaxy, began retreating into older, slower methods because they could no longer trust their own systems. The Spectres didn't target weapons. They targeted confidence. Even non-military assets began vanishing. Logistics ships. convoy managers, planetary administrators, disappearances that created cascading delays. Supplies missed arrival windows. Reinforcements arrived after battles were over. Missed synchronization meant weak points appeared in defenses. And the humans always seemed to know exactly where to hit. The Dominion suspected internal leaks. They purged loyalists. Executed entire departments. Nothing changed. Because it wasn't just about stolen information, it was prediction. Human analysts had mapped Dominion behavior patterns so thoroughly, so completely, that even without intelligence, they could estimate decision-making with terrifying accuracy. It became a psychological war. Commanders started refusing deployments to certain sectors. Rumors spread of cursed systems, zones where human agents walked unseen. Dominion war councils found their meeting chambers bugged with audio files looping their own voices back at them hours before they'd spoken. Holograms activated without input. Maps showed phantom fleets for seconds at a time, always in locations that were later hit by real human units. The Dominion built its empire on certainty. Spectres unraveled that certainty thread by thread. At the heart of Spectre protocols was something even more terrifying than stealth or infiltration: autonomy. These weren't squads waiting for orders. They were independent kill systems, programmed with dynamic objectives and total mission authority. If contact was lost with high command, they didn't retreat. They evolved. They restructured the mission around new parameters in real time. No oversight. No recall. No leash. In several sectors, the Dominion's own AI infrastructure began reporting inconsistencies in its behavioral models. Entire logic clusters started flagging strategic decisions as self-contradictory. Some networks shut themselves down to prevent perceived corruption. But the truth was simpler: human intrusion had already happened, so seamlessly that the systems didn't realize they'd been altered until it was too late. In one case, a Dominion fleet attempted to rendezvous near the edge of the Crenari expanse. Their beacon signals were perfectly mirrored by Spectre drones. Half the fleet followed the false signal into an asteroid field laced with dormant explosives. By the time they realized the deception, the field detonated. Not with raw power, but with electromagnetic compression waves that shredded circuits and AI cores without damaging the hulls. The entire fleet became drifting, pilotless wrecks, emptied like shells. The message was not just sent. It was performed. This wasn't about victory in combat. It was about eroding the ability to fight altogether. Dominion Command found themselves issuing orders that no longer arrived. Setting objectives that could not be acted upon. Field marshals began carrying paper records. Hushed discussions replaced encrypted comms. High Command disbanded half its internal AIs. The Empire began to fold in on itself, not from firepower, but from fear. The Dominion had thought they could demoralize humans through shock and terror. They never expected humanity to be better at it. Civilian populations on Dominion core worlds began to question the illusion of safety. If the Empire's elite could be touched without warning, then no one was safe. Panic turned to paranoia. Internal surveillance increased. Dissent was punished in public. But every punishment felt hollow. Every execution looked desperate. Because no one knew who the humans would strike next. It didn't matter where the fleets were stationed. It didn't matter how many ships they had left. The Empire had lost the one thing it couldn't fight without: control. And in the empty halls of silenced outposts, amidst flickering lights and dead screens, one phrase became legend. They were here. And then they weren't. The Dominion had sent their best. But the humans had already passed them, moved through them, left them behind. And now, all the Empire had was the sound of doors closing quietly behind ghosts no one could see. The Dominion's core systems, once bastions of absolute control, began to fragment beneath the weight of internal doubt and external disruption. Entire star sectors operated weeks behind schedule. Trade convoys rerouted through unauthorized zones. Entire academies of command were dismantled under suspicion of ideological contamination. The illusion of order cracked. But what followed wasn't just collapse. It was chaos bred from precision, the kind only humanity could engineer. Rather than exploiting every vulnerability immediately, humanity let the rot spread. They understood something the Dominion never could. Sometimes, the best way to destroy an enemy is to give them the rope and let them hang themselves. So they watched as Dominion sectors began fighting among themselves, commanders accusing each other of incompetence, betrayal, or Spectre collaboration. Internal investigations turned into purges. Fleet leaders were removed, replaced, and removed again. Protocols stacked on contradictions. Orders were stalled waiting for approvals that would never come. Paranoia bloomed like a cancer. Into that paranoia, humanity released the next phase of their campaign, disinformation. It began with broadcasts, not of human propaganda, but false Dominion orders. They were perfect, linguistically identical, matched to encryption formats, carried authentication keys stolen from deep within military archives. The messages ordered ships to stand down, bases to evacuate, and fleets to redeploy to regions already known to be compromised. Some suspected trickery, but even hesitation led to chaos. Obey the order and risk destruction. Ignore it and risk court-martial. Fear made every option a trap. Dozens of Dominion ships were caught out of position. Reinforcements arrived hours late. Entire fleets moved to protect sectors that had never been in danger. Human units didn't even need to attack. Their enemies were already busy undermining themselves. It was the war version of drowning, a slow suffocation from every direction. In the interior systems, human agents began releasing fragments of classified Dominion history to the public. Not propaganda, truth. Entire events that had been hidden for centuries. Planetary culls, fabricated plagues, resource hoarding during artificial famines. Documents leaked alongside unaltered footage, showing Dominion officials issuing orders that condemned billions. The goal wasn't rebellion. It was disillusionment. Populations once apathetic began to question. Questioning led to unrest. Unrest to resistance. Resistance to open revolt. The Dominion couldn't crush rebellion everywhere. It didn't have the capacity. Every response stretched thinner and thinner, like a net pulled too wide to hold its shape. The High Council ordered full lockdowns. Blackouts. Information suppression. But the data was viral, spreading faster than signals could be blocked. The harder they clamped down, the louder the message became. Dominion elite began fleeing core systems. Some defected to neutral sectors under human protection. Others disappeared, taking their wealth and genetic backups to unknown coordinates. Earth made no attempt to capture them. Their departure was part of the plan. Remove the brain, let the body flail. What was left of the leadership became a hollow husk, technocrats and warlords pretending to be statesmen. In this vacuum, human influence didn't arrive as soldiers or diplomats. It arrived as frameworks, systems for rebuilding, for autonomy, for choice. Colonies ravaged by Dominion control were offered reconstruction AI systems. Energy reactors that required no tribute. Defense systems with no off-switch controlled by outsiders. And the humans never stayed. They offered the tools, then left. No empire. No governance. Just the power to stand up. Even neutral factions began to shift. Cultures that had once ignored the war now sought human consultation. Trade routes realigned. Security pacts formed in secret. Dominion-aligned factions quietly dropped out of communication, unwilling to be seen propping up a sinking regime. Alliances were severed not by battle, but by momentum. The gravitational pull of a collapsing empire was too dangerous to be near. The psychological shift among the Dominion's own people was irreversible. Veterans began refusing deployment. Some units staged mutinies to avoid suicide missions. Entire academies saw cadets defect mid-training. In one instance, a Dominion cruiser rerouted itself into a human-controlled sector and surrendered its crew, declaring themselves refugees. Not prisoners. Not defectors. Refugees. Humanity accepted them. Not with celebration, but with structure. They were integrated, questioned, cleared, and given roles. Not just as soldiers, but as advisors. Because humans weren't just dismantling an empire, they were absorbing its remains. Not to rule, but to ensure it never rose again. The Dominion tried to retaliate one last time by deploying the Crucible Fleet, an armada built over a century, containing every remaining Dreadnought-class vessel, superweapon, and mobile planetary siege platform. It was to be the symbol of resistance, of authority. Its passage through systems was meant to rally fear back to the Empire's side. Instead, it vanished. No wreckage. No distress beacons. Just silence. One moment it was en route. The next gone. Theories ranged from mass sabotage to quantum-fold traps hidden in warped space. Earth offered no explanation. No denial. Just quiet. The effect was catastrophic. Morale collapsed. Officers resigned en masse. Colonies once under armed guard began declaring independence without resistance. Dominion outposts stood abandoned by their own garrisons. Those who remained no longer enforced order, they simply survived. Waiting. The Dominion was still vast, still dangerous. But it had lost its shape. It no longer knew how to be what it once was. Its systems still spun. Its ships still flew. But the empire behind them was gone, replaced by a machine with no mind and no direction. And humanity hadn't fired a single superweapon to make it happen. They simply understood that you don't need to break every bone to collapse a body. You just need to cut off its blood supply. And now, as the Great Dominion wheezed in its final hour, the stars no longer feared its roar. They watched in silence, waiting to see what humanity would choose to do next. The Dominion no longer resembled the empire it once was. Its banners still flew in distant systems, its fleet still orbited a few loyal worlds, but they were ghosts, relics orbiting hollow declarations. Chain of command had fractured into regional fiefdoms, each commander acting independently under the pretense of unity. Orders from high command were now treated as suggestions, often delayed, sometimes ignored outright. The only thing they all agreed upon was fear. Not fear of collapse. Fear of humanity, and the silence that always came before their next move. Despite the disintegration, there remained a core faction, desperate to salvage the remnants of imperial identity. They convened what they called the Continuity Council, former admirals, planetary rulers, and surviving technocrats. Their goal was to re-establish a central authority, consolidate what little they could, and prepare for either a final battle or a negotiated ceasefire. They hadn't yet decided which. They reached out to humanity, not for surrender, but for dialogue. A transmission was sent. Formal. Respectful. Carefully worded to acknowledge past actions without admitting guilt. They asked for terms. Humanity responded with a time and location for a secure channel exchange. But what the Continuity Council received wasn't a diplomat. It was a recording. No faces. No voice. Just words displayed in text on a neutral background. You're not speaking for an empire. You're speaking for its shadow. What you call surrender, we call inevitability. You cannot negotiate with a future already written. You may preserve life. You may choose how the fall unfolds. But there will be no return. The message ended. No follow-up. No reaction to the silence that followed. The council was furious. Some called for renewed war. Others advocated total retreat into isolation. None of their arguments mattered, because while they debated, humanity moved again. This time, it was not specters or data warfare. It was something new. Dominion terraformers stationed in reclaimed sectors began reporting strange anomalies. Environmental systems running too efficiently, energy readings that exceeded expected parameters, machinery operating without command input. When examined closely, they found subtle modifications in the hardware, extra circuitry, firmware alterations, components with no record of installation. The machines had been changed. Without firing a shot, without seizing control, humanity had altered the Dominion's own tools. Their terraforming systems now replenished ecosystems faster than intended. Fuel reactors self-balanced instead of failing. AI systems began protecting civilian infrastructure at the expense of military operations. Humanity had rewritten the code that governed Dominion systems, systems still in use by loyalist regimes. They hadn't hacked from the outside. They had embedded solutions long before the Dominion realized what was happening. A new architecture, invisible and irreversible, now existed beneath everything the Dominion touched. The gesture wasn't sabotage. It was transformation. Entire planets began healing. Water cycles rebalanced. Agricultural centers doubled production. Atmospheric scrubbers removed toxins at record speeds. For the first time in living memory, some of the Dominion's oldest colonies began to flourish, because of human hands. And with that, resistance crumbled further. No one in the outer systems wanted the old ways back. Even loyalist governors, sworn to the High Council, began quietly adapting to human frameworks. They didn't admit it publicly. But resource shipments changed routes. Trade was redirected through neutral zones controlled by former rebels, now using human economic protocols. Bit by bit, survival replaced ideology. And humanity did not exploit it. No blockades. No enforced tribute. No governance. They let those systems choose, openly, freely. Some hesitated. Most didn't. They had seen what the Dominion offered. They had seen what the humans left behind. The High Council grew desperate. In a final show of strength, they attempted to unveil a relic from their ancient war archives, a weapon codenamed Red Echo. It was not designed for battle, but extinction. A planet-cracking resonance weapon capable of liquefying tectonic layers through gravitational pulses. Only used once, in a time no one dared speak of. The weapon was never activated. The moment its systems powered on, they shut back down. Not because of failure, but override. Dominion engineers tried to reboot manually. Every command was rejected. The interface displayed a single phrase, "That path is closed." The weapon had been disarmed by human code inserted years before. During a long-forgotten tech exchange. Humanity had seen it. Predicted it. Buried a failsafe so deep it lay dormant until this exact moment. It had never been about trust. It had been about control. The revelation shattered the last pretense of Dominion strength. If even their most ancient horrors were subject to human oversight, then nothing they possessed was truly theirs anymore. The military, what was left of it, fragmented further. High-ranking officers resigned, fled, or disappeared. The Continuity Council disbanded. Worlds began declaring themselves independent republics, federations, or protectorates, not under Earth, but under their own new governments. Earth remained distant. Watching. Offering help, never pressure. Because now, everyone knew the truth. Humanity had no desire for an empire. They didn't want flags in every corner of space. They wanted something far more radical, a galaxy where no one ruled. Where power did not concentrate, but flowed freely. Where those who rose did so not through conquest, but resilience. The Dominion had sent its best to conquer Earth. And Earth had sent back an idea. An idea that could not be assassinated, silenced, or blockaded. One that slipped past every defense, not as fire, but as seed. Quiet. Patient. Growing. Now, the war was no longer about battles. It was about what would be remembered, and what would never be repeated. The remnants of the Dominion scattered across the stars like ash from a dead fire. Some systems clung to fading banners, pretending the Empire still breathed, hoping to salvage legacy from ruin. Others chose silence, cutting off all transmissions, locking their borders, hoping to be forgotten. But no one truly believed the Dominion still existed. Its identity had collapsed not with explosions, but with the quiet folding of belief. Even in systems where no humans had ever set foot, the people spoke of them, not with fear, but with a strange reverence reserved for forces that changed everything without asking permission. In what was once Dominion space, thousands of new alliances formed, loose, flexible, local. Cultures that had never met began sharing technologies through common formats standardized by human design. Defense systems became collaborative projects. Trade became more fluid than ever before, not because of oversight, but because of trust born from a shared enemy now gone. And at the center of this tectonic shift, Earth remained still. No great fleets roamed in domination. No demands were issued. No human colonies expanded beyond their designated zones. Instead, Earth focused inward. It poured resources into repairing the damage of survival, the scars left not just by the war, but by centuries of isolation, fear, and contingency. Entire generations had grown up preparing for extermination. Now they faced peace. And peace, ironically, proved more complex. The human military did not demobilize, but neither did it grow. It transformed. Units that once conducted silent operations across Dominion worlds now worked to dismantle their own power structures. They were retrained, repurposed, and assigned not to war, but to restoration. Cities broken by orbital bombardments were rebuilt under human design principles, resilient, modular, adaptive. Not just for Earth. For anyone who asked. Applications for assistance began to flood in. Not from conquered worlds, but from those who had watched and waited. Cultures that had avoided the war, choosing neither side, now approached cautiously. They wanted help, not control, not allegiance. And humanity gave it, with one condition, that it never be used to rule another. This was not policy. It was doctrine. Because humanity had learned that survival without principle was simply prolonged decay. They had seen what empires became, what they required, what they consumed. And they had chosen a different path, even if it cost them dominion over everything they'd just torn down. Among many of Earth's allies, this restraint caused confusion. Some urged humanity to take what it had earned, to impose peace through structure, to centralize governance, to build a new order from the ashes of the old. But humanity declined. Not out of virtue, but out of clarity. Empires don't collapse because they're evil. They collapse because they are rigid. Because they demand obedience in a universe that thrives on difference. Earth had no interest in repeating the pattern. Instead of rulers, they became teachers. Human academies opened to alien students across neutral sectors. Not for indoctrination, but for collaboration. Philosophy, governance, biology, strategy. Knowledge once kept secret under the threat of extinction was now shared freely. Not everything, not at once, and not without boundaries. But openly. Because power hoarded is weakness disguised. Power shared is survival multiplied. As Earth extended this quiet hand, its old enemies watched. Some had been silent for decades. Others had never engaged. But all of them now saw the same pattern. Humanity was not expanding. It was stabilizing. Its influence spread not through soldiers, but through systems. And not because it was forced, but because it worked. What began as an uprising became a standard. Former Dominion systems began converting their infrastructure voluntarily. Not to human control, but to human logic. Their own engineers restructured local grids using human-efficient design templates. Their hospitals adopted decentralized resource allocation. Their local councils mirrored Earth's adaptive voting models. These changes were not mandated. They were copied, because they worked. And slowly, almost invisibly, a network emerged. It wasn't an empire. It wasn't even an alliance in formal terms. It was a rhythm, a distributed understanding between cultures that had once shared nothing but fear. They agreed on few things. But they agreed on this, that never again would a single voice dictate the fate of billions. That never again would the stars be ruled by silence enforced through fear. That from now on, every voice mattered, even the smallest. The last of the Dominion's warships, rusting in an outer system dockyard, were salvaged not for combat, but for repurposing. Their hulls were stripped and remade into interstellar relief vessels. Their command decks became mobile hospitals. Their data cores, once fed with tactics and death, were reformatted with linguistic archives and cultural records. From weapons to tools. From dread to hope. In one such ship, renamed Echo of the Hollow, a monument was installed, an open vault holding messages from every world that once suffered under the Dominion. Not declarations of vengeance. Declarations of memory. Children who had never seen war now walked its halls, learning not what had been taken, but what had been rebuilt. Because humanity didn't erase history. They made sure it could never be rewritten. Even among humans, the question lingered, what now? Without an enemy, without an empire to resist, without war to define them, what was humanity supposed to become? The answer wasn't written in treaties or speeches. It was written in actions. In systems rebuilt from ruin. In voices no longer silenced. In skies that no longer bristled with fleets waiting to fire. Humanity became not a force to fear, but a reminder. That the will to survive must be tied to the will to evolve. That strength without compassion is just another form of collapse. And as the stars shifted around this quiet revolution, the galaxy began to forget the Dominion, not because it was erased, but because it had been replaced. Not by another throne, but by a promise. We are not your masters. We are not your saviors. We are what you become when you refuse to kneel. The war was over, but there were no parades, no confetti falling from orbit, no grand declarations from podiums carved in marble. The end came as quietly as the beginning, one world at a time, one silence followed by another. There were still ruins, still scars etched deep into planetary crusts, still orbits cluttered with the debris of shattered fleets. But the guns no longer fired, and that was enough for now. Earth didn't crown itself victorious. Victory had never been the goal. Humanity had learned long ago that wars aren't truly won when the enemy falls. They're won when the survivors refuse to rebuild what was broken. And this time the survivors, across every species, every system touched by the Dominion's shadow, refused. Some of the last Dominion outposts were discovered years later, buried beneath moon rock or hidden in decaying stations floating in gravitational dead zones. Their occupants hadn't fought. They hadn't run. They'd simply endured, waiting for orders that never came. When found, they weren't punished. They were offered food, medical aid, and truth. Not vengeance, understanding. Because punishment was the language of the old order. Humanity had no interest in repeating the grammar of oppression. Even among the scattered remnants of Dominion civilians, those raised in fear, taught obedience from birth, a new narrative was forming. Some resisted it. Most didn't. They watched how humanity treated others, how they rebuilt without occupation, how they taught without rewriting cultures. And slowly, suspicion gave way to curiosity. Curiosity became collaboration. Then trust. On Earth, leaders began stepping down, not out of shame, but fulfillment. They hadn't sought power for power's sake. They had sought it to protect. Now, with peace taking root, they made way for a new generation. One not shaped by survival drills and contingency plans. One raised in the aftermath of an impossible victory. That new generation didn't see the stars as something to be conquered or feared. They saw opportunity in every direction. Not for war, but for contact. Diplomats replaced tacticians. Architects replaced strategists. Exploration ships left orbit with no weapons on board, only survey drones and translators. Some worlds welcomed them openly. Others took time. But no new conflicts erupted, because humanity wasn't arriving with terms. They were arriving with questions. Those who remembered the Dominion expected Earth to fill the void, to claim the abandoned thrones, to rewrite the stars with their insignia. But Earth never did. Power is a gravity few can resist, but humanity had been pulled into that singularity before. They'd escaped it once. They refused to fall again. Instead, Earth shared the void. A network of relay stations built across neutral ground connected distant species, not through force but mutual curiosity. Shared databases grew, containing languages, histories, biology, and even failures. The dark age that had loomed for centuries was receding, and in its place bloomed something fragile but persistent: coexistence. Some resisted still. Fringe factions clung to Dominion nostalgia, whispering of return, of purity, of control. But they found little ground. Because in the absence of tyranny, fear lost its grip. The young had not grown under banners or boots. They had grown in a world of open skies and unfiltered data. They didn't crave order. They craved meaning. And humanity, at last, had found its own. It was no longer a species defined by its desperation, its rage, or even its cleverness. It had become something harder to define, an anchor. Not at the center of power, but at the edge of collapse, holding the line so others could rise. On the 100th anniversary of the first Dominion strike against Earth, a single transmission was sent into deep space. It contained no threats. No calls for unity. No claims. Just a record, a neutral log of what had happened, what had been done, and what had been chosen instead. The file ended with a statement from an anonymous contributor, possibly human, possibly not. It read, "The stars are silent again. Not because we silenced them, but because we listened long enough to hear ourselves." That transmission became part of every educational archive across the known systems. It wasn't mandatory. It wasn't enforced. But people read it. Not just because it was history, but because it was honest. Brutal, flawed, unembellished. And in that honesty, they found something rare: trust. Humanity had not made itself untouchable. It had made itself undeniable. Not through terror. Not through dominion. But through the quiet, relentless refusal to be what others expected. What had begun with fleets and fire had ended with blueprints and bridges. The galaxy hadn't just survived its greatest war, it had transcended it. Not perfectly. Not cleanly. But irreversibly. And in the quiet orbit of a once burned Earth, beneath the repaired sky, Generations walked on green fields that had once been launch platforms, never knowing the war their ancestors had endured to give them silence. Not peace. That was too fragile a word. But silence, the kind that comes not from the end of sound, but from the absence of fear. That was the victory. And that was enough.